Sweet.
Bill?
Hey, yeah, Bill Dague. I'm with the NASDAQ Quandl team. Been at NASDAQ for a number of years, worked on all sorts of different things. Big data warehousing, in the cloud. I led our data science team. And then when we acquired Quandl, moved over to that team to help create new, unique, interesting sources of information, and also to help our clients, make the most of data. So how can we help them, be efficient with how they use it and process it internally? So happy to talk about that.
Thank you. And Ravi?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ravi Trivedi. I lead data science and AI platforms at Nuveen. My team is responsible for managing data science automations and ML ops, which means gathering data to building models to monitoring and things like that. I've recently founded a company called 19 AI, which is a tech startup building no-code AI platforms, which allows everyone, non-technical users, to build predictive models. Thank you.
Wonderful. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about how to build a data strategy from scratch to start with. As we said, a few years ago, it was all about alternative data and the volume of data. At the same time, onboarding data is hard and time consuming. How do you see the current landscape with regards to data and a data strategy? Let me start in reverse order just for fun. Ravi?
Yeah, sure. So, if you look at the market, market is matured with the tools that will allow you to quickly source different data sets and do self-services, right? But the issue that we saw in the past was basically, companies were getting ad hoc data, point of the time data sets to integrate with their models, and they were not able to automate. So I think the focus is shifting more towards the end-to-end automation, the ML ops, automating the whole pipeline. So now the companies are looking at, how do we not just look at how much data we ingested, but how is that data helping out in the bigger picture, right? So they're looking at, the model drifts and how they need to fix it as part of that data pipeline. So I think it's really shifting more towards how do we make use out of that data and how do we automate the end-to-end pipeline?
Makes a lot of sense. And then as more data gets more commoditized, as asset class, people get familiar with the data, how do we move from now on? What is competitive from now on? What are your observations on the current landscape? Maybe Bill?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if you look back over the past 5 or 6 years, maybe longer than that for some firms, there was a bit of a space race, and there was a lot of value in just getting data and having that and sort of integrating it. It was I think for many places it was philosophy like let's get it done. I think what that has sort of led to is a lot of fragmentation and a lot of sort of tech and data sprawl. I talked to many clients that we're buying duplicate data license and we didn't even know because our pods don't talk to each other, right? So I think right now there's a bit of a shift, or there's a push towards sort of maturing those processes and those best practices that firms are using to allow them to scale. Because I think I think this next sort of phase is really about scale and it's about efficiency. Ravi, you mentioned automation. I think that's a big part of it. Because like in a sense, data has become beta, right? It's assumed that you're good at data, that you have data, access to data. It's table stakes. So now the conversation is, what's the ROI I get on data, right? Is this something that, do I have the pipes and the processes to take a new source and really get business value out of it? Or is it the incremental IT cost and spend, coordination, sort of a drag on how effective I can be? So a lot of firms are having to, sort of do this introspection and think about, how they can improve. And a lot of them are asking the question, is this something I want to differentiate on? Obviously data is important and it's a key driver for decision making today. But is building your own tech, and infrastructure something you want to differentiate on as a core to my business? So I think that's a lot of the conversation that's happening in the market right now.
Interesting. Data as beta. I like it. Rebeca, what are your observations on the current landscape before we dive into details?
Yeah, 100% totally agree with my colleagues here. I think, as you were saying before, maybe a couple of years ago, there was a really big push towards new data sets. And I think that really just highlighted for a lot of people some of the inefficiencies in the internal pipelines. That yes, sure, we could get the data, but we're not using it, we're not turning it around fast enough to actually be able to get the value from it that we really need to get. So very much, if you're kind of thinking from a strategy perspective, I think you need to always be focused on flexibility within that pipeline. How adaptive can you be to these new data sets, and also the kind of integrations, how open, like I know that there's a lot of talk about open source, but I think the open source is different to open tech. So what is this technology actually open for interacting with and working with other technologies? So those are the two things that I think people are very much focused on these days, how flexible it is and how open it is.
As a hedge fund, as a portfolio manager and former co-head of quant research, one of the things that mattered to me the most is sort of the organizational point of view. Like, how do you make sure you have the process in place to get the best out of your investment professionals, data scientists, engineers? How do you make people work most cohesively with data? Bill touched on this, so maybe I'll start from the other two. Ravi, what are your thoughts on organizational structure? Have you seen anything interesting that you've observed, any changes recently?
Yeah. No, I think, you talked about investment professionals, data scientists, and engineers, right? At the end of the day, they all have to work together as one team. So many organizations are using the cross-functional approach where, they have a data organization, but, they would have the data scientist work as part of the portfolio manager's team or whatever team they're part of. So, that's the trend that I'm seeing. One way is to develop a COE that removes the complexity around like the common task, right? Like, how do I connect to this or how do I do that? All those common things could be automated just by creating a COE, right? To kind of build accelerators and things like that. But they are really moving towards a real cross-functional integration of the teams. So it's no longer one data science team. The data science and portfolio managers are part of the same team working to get the same goal achieved.
What about the other two panelists? Do you also observe the same sort of cross-functional approach from your clients? Do you hear anything different?
Yeah, so I definitely when we're kind of looking at the clients that are towards the larger end, there seems to be a sort of a separation between engineering, creating those pipelines, creating that infrastructure, and then, the investment managers using the I suppose, effectively the plumbing to get all of the data that they need. And then it seems like the data scientists are either existing sort of kind of very close to that engineering team where they are, they're looking for patterns, really. They find something interesting, and these are signals that are then being sent through to the investment managers. And in some cases, if it's a particularly big organization or a particularly private pod, as I think we all know that they are quite private, the data scientists might be just actively within a pod, kind of working specifically towards that pod's sort of end goals. But the other thing that I'm definitely seeing as well is that those investment management pods, they are looking for more freedom with the data. They're kind of looking for these environments where they can have more control over the data, where they can use the tools that they want. I think we're moving away from the days of being prescriptive about the toolings that people use. People know what they like and what they want. And certainly, I know we're not on the topic yet, but this is where I think cloud is actually having a really big impact in terms of giving people that freedom and empowering them to use the tools that they would like.
Cloud is a very good question. Maybe I'll start diving in a little bit deeper into the infrastructural elements of a good data strategy, and please feel free to jump back and sort of address previous questions as we go along. How do you think about the data sort of architecture overall when you think about the data strategy? Cloud versus in-house versus hybrid is definitely a question. Should you build versus buy? What do you observe in terms of different sizes of companies or teams? What do you think about open source solutions, partnerships with third-party sort of technical teams? How would you think about architecture? Maybe Bill?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think sort of building off the previous point, right? It depends sort of a little bit how you're structured, and you have to understand where you are and where you want to go. You know, if you have a centralized team and you can manage things at scale, I think that's, you know, that's a really good model, and we're seeing that a lot more. You know, there's obviously no one answer, and everybody has to do the cost benefit, but I think cloud is a really important key enabler. I think you get economies of scale, you get abstractions that I think are really, really helpful in helping keep your focus on more of the business applications and less on some of the, you know, the IT infrastructure and the DevOps and that kind of thing. I definitely see a lot more of a movement towards outsourcing and buying solutions than building. And I think that makes a lot of sense because, as I said before, the cost benefit of, you know, building versus buying, you know, what is my core differentiator? What am I really gonna, you know, what's really gonna drive my business? A lot of the problems in the data space, the data workflows have been solved in one way or another. There are a lot of great tools out there, both open source and proprietary, sort of off the shelf. So in many cases, especially if you have a really wide gap, you're much better off sort of building something and getting it deployed quickly. So just, you know, get time to value way down and just, you know, get going than going through a complex build and you know, starting from zero. So I think I see a lot of firms doing that, especially ones that have been sort of under investing in sort of the data infrastructure for a while.
Interesting. And Rebecca, you touched on cloud. Do you want to expand on that a little bit more, on your thoughts, and broaden out on architecture and how you think about the infrastructure of onboarding data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, architecture is really a passion point for me. I was an architect, a solutions architect for quite a number of years before I kind of came into this position. So yeah, 100%, you know, it's sort of, if you think about the Ford assembly line and the sort of impact that had on manufacturing, I think cloud is having a similar impact in terms of, you know, really kind of lifting a lot of the restrictions that were in place. And one thing that people sort of sometimes overlook is that it's much more granular from an accounting perspective. So if you want, you know, it's much more transparent. Well, okay, where is my money going and which group is using it and how can I sort of link that back to the value that's being delivered? I mean, Bill touched on it there. It's really about scale in a lot of cases, being able to quickly respond. That responsiveness is very, very important, as well as giving people the sort of freedom to have the environments that they want to work with. Typically in-house, you know, if you're like a quant developer, you don't, if you're working on an internal server, you don't have your sudo access. You can't really, you know, you're restricted in terms of the tooling that you can use. But a lot of people are sort of using these cloud environments, and actually some of the, in my experience with our clients, some of the earliest adopters of these kind of cloud services have been the sort of the quant teams that are working historically with massive amounts of data, and really just want that freedom to be able to self-serve as much as they possibly can while working off of the centralized data store. I think considering the industry we're in, the solution is always going to be a hybrid solution, because I don't think colo is going anywhere anytime soon. But you know, it's actually, it's a lot more straightforward than people might think to kind of set up these hybridized solutions, and really address the needs of everyone across the business. Yeah.
Wonderful. Ravi, your thoughts on architecture and cloud and how to sort of think about a data infrastructure?
Yeah, you know, I think we should define the architecture based on the usage or the capabilities that we want to enable. So I would say there are three components to architecture before even we go into the cloud or on-prem, right? So what is the availability? So, you know, is it going to be there whenever they want to use it, right? The second is performance, right? Is it optimized enough at the best level that it will work? And the self-service, right? So capability to kind of allow users to spin up infrastructure on their own and things like that. So once we have those figured out, we'll get some idea around, you know, should we go on-prem or should we go on cloud? But then deciding whether we want to choose cloud also depends on the appetite of the risk right, that the company has. Some company may not want to put their secret sauce on cloud, although, it can be virtually private cloud. So it just depends on how willing are you to take that risk. In terms of open source, there's a lot of innovation going on. But one thing I would say is, whatever architecture is defined, we should put the standards and bake it into the platform in the beginning, then going to figure out the governance and things like that at the end. So thanks.
One of the aspects that I would like to dive a little bit deeper in, no one really sort of focused on the aspect of cost. This, of course, is at the back of the minds of smaller as well as larger, but probably more smaller teams and hedge funds out there. A lot of people in the audience. I want to give you all an opportunity to share any thoughts on how that infrastructural sort of plan and architecture might differ for different sizes or categories of funds, for example, hedge funds versus asset managers. Who wants to dive in first? I'll give you an option.
I can maybe take a crack at that. I mean,
yep.
I wanted to interject on the cloud conversation actually, because it's important to know that the cloud is not always cheaper, especially when you're unlocking things and giving people freedom to experiment, and it can use a lot more cycles. And I think you can get a lot more infrastructure, and it can over time. You're always paying it instead of depreciating it on the balance sheet, et cetera. So it's important to sort of understand that dynamic. But the benefits, I think, outweigh that cost of you're able to be more agile. You're able to do more. That I think it's worth it in the end. With respect to different types of organizations, I think it really comes down to the kind of investor you are, and what your strategies require, and what scale you need to get to. I think I've seen a lot of smaller funds kind of struggle to get off the ground. If they're very trading heavy strategies, for example, data is so key, and finding great data talent and setting up that initial architecture, that initial sort of pipeline is critical. And if you're struggling with that, it can be almost a deal breaker. So I think just focusing a lot on that, and yeah, it's tough. It's tough when you can't get the talent, right? But I think that's the other piece of this. There is so much importance, and there's so much demand for this kind of expertise that becomes a challenge as well.
When asset managers think about their competitive advantage, I mean, data onboarding, the process in and of itself was a differentiator a few years ago. The more there are internal and third-party solutions for this, and they're quite robust. What do you think managers should do from now on, and what should they do on the other side, not just ingesting data, but sort of as the forecasting efficacy of data sets and strategies sort of diminishes, being dynamic on that? What are your observations, Ravi? I'll ask you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I think one thing that is most important is you're able to prove that you're using that data set and it's generating a value for you, right? So I would say that from the beginning, to set up the key metrics so that you can do data quality checks and things like is the number of records coming on around the same line, or what are the data quality checks, how many of them are failing, because that may be able to tell you right away whether that data set makes sense anymore or not, right? Because early on it may make sense, but as 1 year or 2 year worth of data comes in, you realize that it's not adding any value, it's just noise, right? So having that data quality checks and monitoring the key KPIs, that would be very key to deciding whether you want to keep going with that or switch to a different data source.
Very good points. KPIs and looking at quality of the data. If I expand on that theme a little bit more, what sort of metrics, SLAs, would you put in place to monitor your data ingestion engine and infrastructure, to the other panelists as well? Maybe Rebeca?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think all of Ravi's points were very, very, on the nose. I do think as well, beyond just sort of monitoring. I think you sort of have to look at the access patterns, who's using it, how much is it being used, and that'll be one of your, quickest indicators that this is the data isn't serving a purpose any longer. And I think you really have to be proactive in terms of these metrics. It's sort of no good if you kind of think on the ingestion side of things. It's no good sort of finding out that your system is down once when that's already in effect. You need to. It's a bit late. The horse has already left, or whatever that expression is. But you kind of have to be keeping a conscious eye on it and actually understanding really how you're using the data further down the line is what's really going to help you create the most meaningful metrics. So if you know that one particular part of your data is the one that is most impactful to your organization, then you need to really be making sure that you're focusing on that when it comes to the metrics. And I think that's the most fundamental one, making sure that your metrics are ones that are going to help you proactively, as opposed to just a retrospective analysis of what went wrong.
Yeah, just to sort of build on that, I think I've been talking about the sort of ROI on data. And I think that for me, there are a lot of components to that, obviously, and it's obviously a complex calculation, but I think sort of keeping that in mind, I think sort of going back to that the previous question about what is a competitive advantage, what does a process look like that's going to give competitive advantage. One of the more sophisticated sort of structures I've seen is not just having a centralized data tech and data infrastructure, but there's also a centralized data products group. And it's almost like an internal business where your stakeholders are the downstream lines of business, and your job is to build products that people use. And so you can actually, sort of get a sense for the efficacy of a data set or a product. Like, what's the uptake? Are people using it? How is it being incorporated into strategies? Obviously, that doesn't work for every organization, but I think that's a really powerful way to sort of help bridge the gap between data as it comes in and data as it needs to be used in terms of getting business value. So I think that's really a nice way to sort of up the data ROI, but also give you a lot of sort of attributable sort of information about what data is really doing for you.
Ravi, I see you raised your hand. I think you have a follow-up point on this one.
Yeah. So, just to add to that, right, some of the key metrics that you could track is the number of jobs getting ingested or files getting ingested versus, number of records coming in. So once you gather all this data, you can also do some kind of predictive maintenance. So you can see whether, every day, if you're supposed to get 100,000 record from this source, suddenly, why did you get only 5,000 today, right? So you can do all those metrics and checks that will notify you based off of, what is going on, because eventually that is part of your pipeline. So it's going to impact the models that you built on top of that. So it could be even stopped right there during the ingestion or the transformation process.
Wonderful. I see we already have some very interesting audience questions. I want to encourage anyone to go into the chat and do ask questions that you want to hear from the panelists. I want to give people time to answer those. So maybe we can go for some final thoughts about the future. It used to be that data was the disruptor. Now you all spoke about data as beta and cloud as the disruptor, like for the production line. How do you see the future from now on? And then I want to open it up to audience questions. I'll go alphabetically by first name. Bill.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think I've been harping on this this idea of data ROI, and I think what that means is you really have to be connecting the dots all along the way, and data coming in to business outcomes, decisions that I made because I'm more informed. And I think, yeah, certainly getting the data in is no longer sort of the innovative thing. It's all about innovating on that business layer. I think in the future, we're going to see a lot more focus, a lot more innovation happening in the application layer of how I take data that's all in one place or is normalized and structured, and do something useful with it, right? So I think that's probably the key. I've also seen a lot of interest from clients, especially talking about, okay, once I get all the data there, I need the first step in that is people need to know where to find it. They need to know where to go to get the data. So data discovery, search, especially context aware, so contextual search or contextual usage of a data set. So if I'm a commodities desk, I have different needs than a fixed income desk, or different analysts may have different opinions on how accounting rules should be applied. So giving people the flexibility to access data in a way that makes sense to them, search for data in a way that's relevant to them, I think is going to be really powerful.
Flexibility. Ravi, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it all goes back to ROI, right? All the things that we're talking about. But now that cloud is easy, data is easy, the next step would be, automation, right? I mean, MLOps or just the operations or automating the end-to-end pipeline. That would be the key focus. And once that happens, that's when you can exactly say, this is working out, or this is the impact that we were able to make using this data sets, right? That's where you can really say that this has an ongoing impact or not.
And Rebeca, closing thoughts on the panel from you?
Yeah, I think in the future, I think you sort of addressed it earlier on, but there was the discussion of build versus buy. And I think with this whole movement to the clouds, everything is much more microservices based. So I think we're actually going to see that dichotomy sort of fall away, and we're going to look at the market in a few years, and it's going to be a lot more microservice based. So you'll have an application that's a small part of your larger infrastructure that will do a particular thing. And, then it will be survival of the fittest, really. Whoever best provides that particular component will be who you'll go with, and it should be relatively straightforward when most of the plumbing is being handled at a unified layer, like for example in the cloud. So I think we'll see a lot of that, and I also think that it's going to continue to be essential to have that pipeline really smooth and engineered well. So I think anybody who's looking now should be thinking about flexibility, openness, and those sort of microservices based architectures.
Wonderful. I want to try to fit as many of the audience questions as we can. If we don't get to your questions, I will ask the panelists to follow up, but bear with us. There was a very interesting question on spurious correlations and data mining. How do you think about that in the presence of very correlated data? Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I can kind of start. I think this is something we deal with on sort of a different part of the Quandl business line, which is where we produce data products, and where we take in input sources, we figure out what works well together, and figure out how we can create a product that's going to be reliable and a unique source of alpha for our client. And I think spurious correlation is always something that is kind of scary, and you have to think about it. I think there are a lot of statistical tests for it. One sort of way to combat it is to get enough history, make sure you really understand the data and where it's coming from and what it means. What am I measuring? What are the lags and that kind of thing? I think that really helps sort of give you a baseline of what this data should be able to do for me. And then of course, clients have their own strategy. Even if you find something that is orthogonal to all of the main FAMA French factors or whatever, clients may still have something that's correlated in their own strategy already, right? And so there's a little bit of, you have to continue to test, continue to see what's the uplift I'm getting from a data set. I think clients do that, when we pass them a data set, they do that same test. So I think it's just continuing to iterate and make sure that you're checking your assumptions and being statistically rigorous.
Excellent. There's a question about open source tools. What tools would you recommend to smaller shops getting started? And I'll keep throwing questions. Any of the panelists that want to answer a previous question, please feel free to raise your hand or come back to it when at any point. Who wants to take open source tools?
Yeah, I can take this one. So I think, there's a lot of innovation happening in open source. You'll see multiple tools being used, adding some value. But in a high level, if you're looking to get started with the data science area, you should definitely look into Jupyter Hub, ML Flow, and Airflow, right? Those three things really give you that end-to-end development, operations, and automation platform that if these three integrates together, you can make a really good data pipeline, ML pipeline out of it.
Wonderful. There's a question about data and how to make data available to data scientists through central APIs, through direct access to various data sources. Maybe Rebecca, given your past in architecture, you want to take this one?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, I'm bullish on microservices. So 100%, I would say central API, because that's going to make it so much easier for you to avoid any sort of lock-in to any particular applications or whatever. You can, if you're making this available through APIs, you have the ability there to tag in all of those other things that we talked about, like monitoring the access of the data, monitoring, where it's being used, where it's going. It's really, I would be very heavily in favor of API level access. Obviously, when you're kind of working with, particularly sensitive data or particularly IP heavy areas, you might need to sort of give a little bit more freeform access. But I think APIs are very much the best way of going about it, to be honest. You can, there's still ways, even with that need for freeform, to still lock it in through an API. Yeah.
I would like to agree with that. I think APIs are really powerful, especially for connecting to downstream applications and sort of having just nice, well-defined interfaces. And also really, really important for data governance too. It can be hard to gate what's happening with data if you give direct file access. That said, going back to the previous question of what are some of the best open source technologies, I've seen a lot of clients getting a lot of value out of Databricks and the Delta files, Delta IO files as a storage format. It scales really well. It handles things like point in time and things very elegantly, and it can help. If you're thinking about sort of the storage layer, can be really effective, and it can power a lot of downstream tools. So to the extent that your workloads require direct file access, that could be a really good medium.
Very good points. A follow-up question on that to some extent, and it's a question that we sometimes get unrelated to this conference. In terms of third-party data solutions, the value of the service they provide in terms of ID mapping, combining, etc., correcting mistakes versus Ravi touched on point-in-time data, having as clean data as possible, initial solution without backfilling. Any thoughts on broader architectural aspects of this for large and small firms? Whoever wants to take this one, or sorry, I'll take one.
I think I was maybe missing the question in there. Apologies. So you're asking about
the trade-off between value added you get from third-party data aggregators versus corrections that dilute sort of the originality of data and point in time.
Yeah, no, that thanks. That's much clearer now. Yeah, so I think that it's really going to depend on what you're doing. Where are you? What's your main fundamental aim as an organization, and where is it that you're trying? That kind of, as Bill was saying, where do you see that you are adding value into the process? If so, it is a trade-off, right? If you are a smaller firm, you want to get up and going and you want your time to market to be as short as possible, but then you also need to make sure that you have control over the data, that you can do something potentially original or creative that's going to give you that edge. So it's I don't know that there's I don't think there's a one answer for this particular question, unfortunately. I wish I could wave a magic wand and say it's this, go ahead and do it, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced.
As a data provider, I can say it's a very delicate balance,
Right.
knowing when to stop adding value. It's really easy to keep trying to add value to a product and processing it more, joining it with more things. At every step, you're imposing your own opinion, right? And clients might not agree with your opinions. So, to the extent that as a consumer, precision matters, and the more opinionated you are and the more precise you need to be, the further up the chain you need to go, right? And so I think, if you're looking at applications that are just for reference or at longer timescales, maybe you don't need to be as precise. I think you can get a lot of value out of an intermediary who consolidates and normalizes a data set. But as you get into the finer structure of it, you need to be more and more careful.
There's a question, what are the typical characteristics and building blocks of data products that the panelists mentioned?
Yeah, I think I can take this one. So I think the building block is really like, when you think about a data product, you have to think about, how is the integration going to work? How is the automation going to work? As well as, the key secret sauce of data sets. How is that going to play around, right? Like if the data changes, the product should not fail, right? It should be able to take it up itself. So the key blocks, I would say, one is the initial planning phase of the product, where you are trying to determine, okay, I have 100 data sets, but these are the top 10 that are important to me, and I could add 90 other data sets later on. So going through that key initial planning sets and then integration and then building the product, I think those would be the three building blocks. But I would say we can think of this as like a process in SDLC, right? Software development life cycle. You can think about data product as going through the same cycle, because it goes through the planning, it goes through the automation, we have to do maintenance. So that's what I think.
Wonderful. This brings us right on time. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, the panelists and the audience, and enjoy the rest of the conference. This concludes this session. Thank you.